On my 24th birthday, my wealthy adoptive parents took me to an exclusive country club dinner just to hand me severance papers. My mother smirked and told me they only kept me this long for the tax benefits, and now I was dead weight. My father added that they were liquidating my trust to fund my golden child brother. I did not cry or beg. I simply slid the solid gold pen back across the table and told them it was funny they mentioned bloodlines, because my biological family was sitting exactly 3 tables behind them. When my mother turned around, the glass of expensive red wine slipped right through her fingers. Before I dive into exactly what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who entirely underestimated your worth. Sign the severance documents, Layla. We have already paid the notary. You surrender any claim to the family trust, and in exchange, we will not charge you for the dinner you are currently eating. The thick legal-sized document slid across the pristine white linen of the table, stopping inches from my plate of Chilean sea bass. I was sitting in the private dining room of the Onyx Club, the most exclusive invite-only establishment for the Atlanta Black elite. Today was my 24th birthday. I looked up from the contract. My adoptive mother, Yvonne, was adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, looking at me with the exact same clinical disgust she usually reserved for scuffed shoes. "Do not look so dramatic," Yvonne sighed, taking a delicate sip of her Pinot Noir. "Let us be brutally honest here. We only kept you around this long for the state adoption subsidies and the public image it gave your father at the mega church. You are 24 now. You have aged out of the system, which means you are no longer a financial or social asset to this family. You are just dead weight." Next to her sat my adoptive father, Reginald, a real estate mogul and church board member whose face was plastered on billboards across the entire city. He did not even bother looking up from his phone as he spoke. "Your mother is absolutely right, Layla. Trey has a new tech startup that needs a massive capital injection. We are liquidating the secondary trusts to fund his launch. We cannot have a corporate restructuring associate or whatever it is you do in that little cubicle of yours leeching off the family legacy." I looked across the table at Trey, the biological golden child. He smirked at me. At 27, he had never held a job for more than 6 months, yet he was currently wearing a custom suit paid for entirely by the family trust fund. He had always been given the world on a silver platter, while I was treated like the hired help, expected to be forever grateful for the meager scraps falling from their lavish table. Sitting right next to Trey was his wife, Heather, pale blonde and perpetually dripping with condescension. Heather loved to remind everyone how inclusive she was, while simultaneously treating me with absolute disrespect. Honestly, Layla, Heather chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy as she rested her perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "You should really be grateful they took you in at all. Most kids from your background end up in jail or on the streets. Trey is building an empire. You are just pushing papers around an office. It is only fair the wealth stays with the actual bloodline. You need to understand your place in this family dynamic." My parents nodded along, completely agreeing with her cruel assessment of my life. I did not cry. I did not yell. A lifetime of being the family scapegoat had burned the tears out of me by the time I was 12 years old. I had spent years enduring their silent judgments, their excluded family vacations, and their constant reminders that I was a charity case bought to make Reginald look like a savior to his congregation. Instead of giving them the emotional reaction they desperately wanted, I carefully wiped my mouth with my linen napkin. I picked up the solid gold pen Yvonne had provided for me to sign my life away and looked directly into her cold eyes. "It is funny you mention bloodlines, Mother," I said, my voice dangerously calm and barely above a whisper. "And it is even funnier that you think I am just a simple paper pusher." I tossed the pen onto the table. It clattered loudly against the crystal water glasses, ringing out through the tense silence of the private dining room. "I found my birth family 6 months ago." I continued, leaning back in my leather chair and crossing my arms over my chest. "I did not say anything because I wanted to see how far you would actually go tonight." They are sitting exactly 3 tables behind you. Yvonne scoffed, rolling her eyes in absolute disbelief. Oh please, what is this, some ghetto soap opera? Your parents were probably addicts who threw you in a dumpster. Are they here to ask Reginald for a job? Why do not you turn around and ask them yourself? I replied softly, maintaining steady eye contact. Yvonne let out an exasperated sigh and turned her head slowly, a sneer already forming on her lips. But the moment her eyes locked onto table number 3, the sneer completely vanished. All the color drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the beautiful mahogany floor and sending a spray of red across her designer heels. You could hear a tiny pin drop in the perfectly quiet room as she stared directly at the regal woman standing there. The ultimate reckoning had finally arrived tonight. The sound of shattering crystal echoed like a gunshot in the dead silence of the private dining room. Deep crimson wine pooled around the jagged glass shards, seeping into the polished mahogany floor and staining the delicate edges of Yvonne's pristine cream-colored shoes. She did not even flinch or look down at the mess she had just made. She just stared straight ahead, completely paralyzed by shock as the woman from table number 3 pushed back her chair and stood up. This woman was the very definition of commanding elegance. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that radiated quiet authority, but it was not her expensive clothes that made everyone in the room stop breathing. It was her face. Looking at her was like looking into a flawless mirror set 25 years into the future. We shared the exact same high cheekbones, the same sharp jawline, and the same deep brown eyes that were currently fixed on Yvonne with absolute chilling precision. This was Vivian, the woman who had carried me, the woman I had been secretly searching for my entire adult life, and she was not alone tonight. Beside her stood Harrison, my biological father. He was a towering figure with a physical presence that instantly made the opulent room feel incredibly small. His dark suit was immaculate, projecting an effortless, old money wealth that made Reginald's flashy designer labels look cheap and desperate by comparison. Together they walked across the dining room floor, their footsteps steady and deliberate, moving past the startled club waiters and walking straight toward our table. Vivian did not look at Trey. She did not spare a single glance for Heather. Her eyes remained locked entirely onto Yvonne, pinning my adoptive mother to her chair with a gaze so fierce it practically lowered the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. You have a lot of nerve talking about dumpsters. Yvonne Vivian spoke, her voice smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly cold. Especially considering you and your husband paid a corrupt hospital administrator $200,000 to forge a death certificate and steal my infant daughter 24 years ago. A collective gasp ripped through the table. Trey actually choked on his own breath, his eyes darting wildly between Vivian and his mother as he tried to process the accusation. Heather covered her mouth with her manicured hands, her gaze fixed on the undeniable physical resemblance between Vivian and me. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the devastating weight of a 2-decade-old crime finally dragged out into the blinding light. Yvonne opened her mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, strangled sound came out. Her hands shook violently as she grabbed the thick edge of the wooden table to steady her swaying body. That was when Reginald finally snapped out of his stunned paralysis. His face flushed a dark, angry purple, and he slammed both of his hands flat onto the linen tablecloth, rattling the expensive silverware and upsetting a water glass. He pushed himself up to his full height, trying to puff out his chest and project the absolute authority of the untouchable real estate tycoon he deeply believed himself to be. I do not know who you people are or how you managed to get past the front desk, Reginald bellowed, his deep voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. But you are trespassing on private property. This is a closed event hosted by one of the most prominent families in Atlanta. I am a platinum member of this club, and I will have you both arrested for harassment and defamation of character. Waiter, get over here and call security immediately. I want these lunatics thrown out on the street right now. The head waiter stepped forward nervously, his hand reaching for the radio clipped to his belt, but Harrison simply raised a single hand. The quiet gesture possessed so much natural authority that the waiter immediately froze in place, unsure of what to do next. Harrison stepped up beside his wife and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. The warmth of his touch sent a powerful shockwave through my chest, a profound feeling of genuine protection and safety I had never once experienced from Reginald in all my 24 years of living under his roof. "You are not going to call security?" Reggie Harrison said, his voice rumbling with a lethal edge that made Reginald physically recoil and take a step back. "You see, when my daughter told us you were bringing her to the Onyx Club tonight to disown her and force her to sign those severance papers, I figured I should be here in person to oversee the transition. Especially since my private equity firm, Vanguard Capital, officially bought the holding company that owns this entire country club last Tuesday morning. You are currently sitting in my building." Reginald's mouth fell wide open. The aggressive, domineering posture he had just assumed deflated in an absolute instant. Vanguard Capital was a massive titan in the financial world, a corporate name that struck absolute fear into every real estate developer on the East Coast. Reginald knew exactly who Harrison was now, and he fully realized he was completely outmatched and outclassed in every possible way. "This is a complete fabrication," Trey shouted, suddenly slamming his fist onto the table in a desperate attempt to salvage his family's crumbling dignity. He stood up abruptly, his face twisted in panic and misdirected rage. "Layla is a pathological liar. She hired these actors to play a part. She is just some bitter, low-level accountant trying to scam our family because she knows my new tech startup is about to hit $100 million in valuation. She is jealous of our bloodline and our success. She wants to ruin my corporate launch." Heather immediately recognized the rapidly shifting power dynamics in the room and instinctively relied on her favorite and most frequently used weapon. Her pale blue eyes welled up with perfectly timed tears, her bottom lip quivering dramatically as she looked around the room, playing the role of a terrified victim. She grabbed Trey's arm, shrinking behind him as if she were in actual physical danger. "This is so aggressive and uncalled for," Heather cried out, her voice cracking with manufactured fragility and distress. "Layla, why are you doing this to us? We took you into our home. We have been nothing but kind and generous to you your entire life. You are traumatizing my husband and ruining a family dinner. We are a respected, upstanding family, and you are bringing all this ghetto hostility into our safe space." She looked directly at Harrison, letting a single calculated tear fall down her cheek. "You people need to leave right now before someone gets hurt." I watched Heather weaponize her tears, a tired tactic she had used against me for years, to paint me as the angry, unreasonable aggressor whenever I dared to stand up for my own basic respect. But tonight, her performance meant absolutely nothing to me or my real parents. I did not let Harrison answer her ridiculous demand. I did not raise my voice or try to match her manufactured hysteria. Instead, I calmly reached down to the floor, picked up my structured leather tote bag, unzipped the main compartment, and pulled out my tablet. Trey twisted against the iron grip of the federal agents. The expensive fabric of his bespoke suit strained at the seams as they locked the heavy steel cuffs securely around his wrists. He threw his head back and glared at the lead agent with the sheer entitlement of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his 27 years of life. "You are making a massive mistake," Trey spat out, as his voice echoed off the polished mahogany walls of the private dining room. He loudly claimed he was the founder and chief executive officer of a revolutionary tech firm. He insisted he was closing a massive funding round next week that would push his company valuation past $50 million. He threatened that his powerful lawyers would take their badges for arresting a true visionary over a minor clerical error with a credit card. The lead agent did not even blink at the empty threats. He calmly recited the Miranda rights while a second federal agent began searching through Trey and his expensive designer pockets. I stood back and watched the panic beneath the arrogant mask start to fracture and break apart. Trey looked over toward Reginald, fully expecting his powerful father to make a quick phone call and fix the situation, just like he had fixed every failed college class and reckless driving charge in the past. But Reginald was frozen in place and staring at the federal badges with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. "Actually, Trey, your company valuation is currently sitting exactly at zero," I said, breaking the tense silence in the room. Trey snapped his head toward me, and his eyes burned with absolute hatred. He told me I did not know anything about his complex business. He called me a jealous little orphan who could not stand the fact that he built a modern empire while I worked as a nobody in a tiny cubicle. I smiled and walked slowly around the long dining table until I stopped right in front of him. I told him I did not work in a cubicle. I reminded him I was a senior mergers and acquisitions executive, and for the past 48 hours I had been extremely busy acquiring his entire tech empire. Heather let out a loud, dramatic gasp from her corner of the room, where she was currently cowering away from her arrested husband. She cried out in a shaky voice, asking what I was talking about. I looked directly into the terrified eyes of my adoptive brother. I explained that his company was publicly registered, which meant his corporate debt was available for purchase if you knew exactly where to look. I told him that since he had been defaulting on the massive commercial loans he took out using my stolen Social Security number, his angry creditors were more than happy to sell that bad debt to my firm for pennies on the dollar. I revealed that as of 9 o'clock this morning, my financial firm executed a hostile takeover, and I was now the majority shareholder and sole owner of his little fake tech startup. Trey yelled that I could not do that and struggled against the federal agents again, claiming my corporate actions were completely illegal. I replied smoothly that what was actually illegal was setting up a technology company that had absolutely no working technology. I explained to the entire room that when I took control of the company this morning, I legally gained access to all of his internal servers and financial records. I expected to find bad code and gross corporate mismanagement, but instead I found absolutely nothing. There were no software developers on the payroll and no proprietary algorithms and zero product pipeline. The lead agent pulled a folded search warrant from an interior jacket pocket and handed it to Reginald, who was still standing completely paralyzed by the dinner table. The agent stated flatly that the Bureau had already raided the corporate headquarters downtown. He revealed the office was completely empty, except for 3 rented desks and a hidden server closet that was routing money directly to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I turned my attention to my adoptive mother, who was currently clutching the edge of the dining table as if the hardwood floor had turned to quicksand beneath her designer shoes. I kept my voice perfectly calm and steady as I told Yvonne that her beloved golden child was not a tech genius, but a common white-collar money launderer. I explained how he used the fake startup to wash the dirty cash he stole using my identity. He funneled millions of dollars through phantom vendor accounts to pay for his custom-tailored suits and luxury sports cars, and those lavish vacations to Monaco that they all loved bragging about so much. Trey was breathing heavily now and shaking his head back and forth in denial. He stammered that it was just a bridging strategy, and he sounded incredibly desperate and small. He claimed it was just temporary liquidity, and they were going to build the actual software as soon as the massive funding cleared, because he was a misunderstood visionary. I corrected him sharply and called him a pathetic fraud. I reminded him that the federal government does not take kindly to privileged people who use synthetic identities to defraud national banks. Yvonne could not take the pressure anymore. The pristine, flawless facade she had maintained for her entire life was completely shattering in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. She looked at her biological son wearing handcuffs, and then looked at the federal agents with wild, desperate eyes. She lunged forward and screamed that they could not take him away before Harrison and the private security team stepped in to block her path. She pleaded that Trey was a good boy, who simply did not understand complicated financial regulations and insisted he was completely innocent of these charges. The lead federal agent warned her to step back and held up a firm hand to stop her frantic advance. He informed her that her son was facing 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering and suggested she step aside and let the authorities do their job. The sound that tore from Yvonne was like a wounded animal as she shrieked at the horrifying thought of a 20-year prison sentence. She cried out that the agents could not do this because Trey did not come up with the offshore strategy on his own. She insisted her son was simply not smart enough to build a complex corporate laundering structure by himself. The entire dining room went dead silent. Even the federal agents stopped moving as they absorbed this frantic, unprompted confession. Yvonne did not seem to realize what she had just done to her own husband. Her primal maternal instinct to protect her son had completely overridden her highly tuned sense of self-preservation. She spun around on her heels and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at her husband. Her voice echoed loudly in the quiet room as she cried out for Reginald to tell the authorities the truth. She demanded he tell the federal agents that Trey was just following his detailed instructions all along. She screamed that Reginald was the one who taught their son exactly how to set up the Cayman accounts. She completely lost her mind and revealed that Reginald was the one who told Trey to use the megachurch building fund to float the fake startup until the federal loans cleared. She begged him to confess that he orchestrated the whole massive fraud to hide the heavy financial losses from his own failing commercial properties. The echo of Yvonne's frantic confession bounced off the high ceiling of the private dining room and then faded into an incredibly heavy silence. The air in the room suddenly felt thick and unbreathable. Every single person was completely frozen. The lead federal agent slowly turned his head away from Trey and locked his sharp gaze directly onto Reginald. You could actually see the exact moment Reginald realized his own wife had just handed him a federal prison sentence on a silver platter. The deep purple color of his face drained away instantly, leaving behind a sickly pale gray. Reginald began to violently shake his head back and forth. He took a large step away from Yvonne as if she had suddenly caught a highly contagious and deadly disease. He raised both of his hands in the air, facing the federal agents, with a look of manufactured outrage. He tried to smooth down the lapels of his expensive jacket to project authority, but his fingers were trembling so badly he could barely grip the fabric. "That woman is completely hysterical!" Reginald barked out, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of the moment. "She does not know what she is talking about. I have absolutely nothing to do with my son and his business ventures. Trey is an adult, and he makes his own financial decisions. If he decided to embezzle money from the church building fund and set up illegal offshore accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle, then that is entirely on him. I am a respected pillar of the Atlanta community, and I will not let the criminal actions of a deeply disappointing son drag down my pristine legacy." I watched Trey flinch as if he had been physically struck across the face. The arrogant golden child who had spent his entire life being coddled and protected was now staring at his father in absolute disbelief. The impenetrable bond of their perfect bloodline was shattering into a million tiny pieces right in front of my eyes. Trey opened his mouth to argue, but the federal agents pushed him firmly down into his chair and advised him to remain silent. Reginald completely ignored his son and turned his attention back to the federal agents. He puffed out his chest and tried to summon the commanding presence of a wealthy real estate tycoon. "I am a titan of industry," Reginald declared loudly, pointing a finger down at the mahogany table. "My commercial real estate empire is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I own office parks, luxury high-rises, and shopping centers all across the state of Georgia. Why on earth would a man with my massive level of personal wealth ever need to steal a few $1,000,000 from a church fund? The very idea is completely absurd. My properties generate more liquid cash in a single month than my son has seen in his entire life. I demand that you release me from this ridiculous investigation immediately so I can contact my corporate attorneys." I could not help but let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound of my laughter cut through his booming monologue and immediately drew the attention of every person in the room. I walked slowly over to my seat and picked up my tablet for the second time tonight. My biological parents, Vivian and Harrison, stood quietly behind me, radiating a sense of calm, absolute power that made me feel completely invincible. "You really love talking about your massive real estate empire, Reginald," I said, keeping my voice smooth and dangerously polite. "You have spent the last 10 years making sure everyone in this city believes you are an untouchable billionaire. You love bragging about your luxury high-rises and your premium shopping centers. But the funny thing about commercial real estate is that you do not actually own any of those beautiful buildings, do you? The banks own them. You just hold the massive, heavily leveraged mortgages." Reginald narrowed his eyes and clenched his jaw tight. That is standard corporate procedure, he snapped back, trying to sound dismissive. Every major developer uses leverage to build their portfolio. The banks are perfectly happy to do business with me because I am Reginald Washington, and my name guarantees success. Your name guarantees absolutely nothing anymore, I corrected him, tapping the screen of my tablet to pull up a new set of financial documents. Let us talk about your flagship property, the Onyx Tower downtown. It is currently sitting at 40% occupancy because you cannot afford to finish the interior renovations. Or maybe we should talk about the Peachtree Plaza shopping center. Your anchor tenants moved out 6 months ago, and your variable interest rate on that specific commercial loan just skyrocketed. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, watching the remaining arrogance melt right off his face. 30 days ago, Reginald, 3 of your largest commercial mortgages officially reached maturity. I continued, my voice ringing clear and steady. You owed the central banks over $80 million in balloon payments. You tried to refinance the loans, but every single bank denied your application because your cash flow is practically non-existent. That is why you told Trey to steal from the church fund. You were desperately trying to scrape together enough liquid capital to cover your missed mortgage payments and avoid triggering a total portfolio collapse. Reginald swallowed hard. Sweat was now visibly beading on his forehead and rolling down the side of his neck. Even if I missed a payment, he stammered, his voice dropping to a nervous whisper. The banks will negotiate with me. They always negotiate. They do not want to foreclose on massive commercial properties. They will extend my terms because they need my expertise to manage the buildings. That is where you are wrong again, I said, offering him a cold, predatory smile. You see, the banks were completely tired of dealing with your constant excuses and your toxic debt. They wanted your bad loans off their balance sheets immediately. So they packaged all of your defaulted commercial mortgages together and put them up for sale on the private distressed debt market. They sold your entire portfolio for pennies on the dollar to a private holding company just to wash their hands of you. Reginald stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. His breathing became shallow and rapid. What holding company? He demanded, his voice trembling with genuine fear. Who bought my loans? I slowly raised my hand and pointed a single finger directly at my own chest. My holding company bought your loans, Reginald, I whispered, watching the absolute horror dawn on his face. I used the capital backing from my biological father and his private equity firm to purchase every single piece of debt you owe in this world. The banks do not own your buildings anymore. I do. And as your sole primary creditor, I am officially calling in all of your loans effective immediately. Reginald stumbled backward until his legs hit a dining chair and he collapsed heavily into the seat. He stared at me with his mouth hanging open as the catastrophic reality of the situation finally crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He realized in that exact moment that he was completely and utterly bankrupt. Reginald sat frozen in the dining chair, his chest rising and falling in shallow, erratic movements. The knowledge that his entire financial empire had just been swallowed whole by the daughter he had spent decades treating like garbage seemed to short-circuit his brain. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The federal agents standing behind Trey did not even blink at the revelation of his bankruptcy. They were here for criminal charges, not unpaid mortgages. Vivienne moved then. My biological mother stepped out from behind me and walked slowly toward the center of the room. The clicking of her heels on the hardwood floor sounded like a countdown timer. She did not look at Reginald with anger. She looked at him with the cold, clinical precision of a federal judge who was about to deliver a life sentence. She reached into the sleek leather briefcase she had carried into the restaurant and pulled out a single sheet of paper, protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. You thought the financial ruin was the end of this, Reginald, Vivienne said, her voice echoing clearly through the silent private dining room. That is just the beginning. What you owe the banks is nothing compared to what you owe me and my family. Reginald finally managed to tear his gaze away from me and look at Vivienne. His face was covered in a cold sweat. I do not owe you anything. He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. I took that girl in when nobody else wanted her. I gave her a home and a name. I saved her. Vivienne did not raise her voice, but the sheer force of her presence made everyone in the room hold their breath. "You did not save anyone," she stated flatly. "You purchased a prop for your public relations campaign." Vivienne placed the plastic sleeve onto the mahogany table and pushed it directly in front of Reginald. She tapped the glass with her manicured finger. "This is a bank record obtained through a federal subpoena," she explained smoothly. "It is a highly detailed trace of a wire transfer made exactly 24 years ago. The amount is exactly $250,000. The sender is listed under one of your earliest holding companies. The recipient is a private offshore account that belonged to Dr. Arthur Vance, the former chief administrator at Mercy General Hospital." The blood entirely drained from Reginald's face, leaving his skin a terrifying shade of gray. He stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Vivienne continued, her voice relentless. 24 years ago, I gave birth to a healthy baby girl at Mercy General. My husband Harrison and I were told there had been catastrophic complications. Dr. Vance personally came to my recovery room and looked me in the eye and told me my daughter had not survived the night. We held a funeral. We mourned a child we thought was buried in the ground. But our baby was not dead. She was lying in the pristine nursery of your massive estate because you paid a corrupt hospital administrator $250,000 to falsify death records and bypass the entire legal adoption system. The room descended into absolute chaos. Yvonne, who had been sitting in a state of catatonic shock, suddenly let out a piercing wail and covered her face with her hands. Trey strained against the grip of the federal agents, his eyes wide with horrified disbelief. The remaining country club staff who had lingered near the doors quietly slipped out, unwilling to witness any more of this catastrophic family collapse. "Why would he do that?" Trey stammered, looking frantically between his father and Vivienne. "Why would he buy a baby when he already had me?" I turned to look at my adoptive brother. "Because your father was trying to secure the massive downtown redevelopment contract from the city council?" I answered for Vivienne. At the time, Reginald was considered a ruthless cutthroat developer who evicted low-income families without a second thought. The city council was refusing to grant him the zoning permits he needed because his public image was incredibly toxic. He needed a miracle to soften his reputation. Vivienne nodded slowly. "And what better way to manufacture a miracle than to adopt an abandoned infant?" she said, her tone laced with absolute disgust. "You played the role of the generous Christian savior perfectly, Reginald. You paraded Layla in front of the local news cameras. You gave tearful interviews about opening your heart and your massive home to a child who had nobody else. The city council was so moved by your incredible philanthropy that they approved all of your zoning permits the very next month. You used my stolen daughter to secure a $1 billion development deal." "It is a lie!" Reginald shouted, suddenly finding his voice. He slammed his hands on the table and tried to stand, but his legs gave out and he slumped back down. "You cannot prove any of this. Dr. Vance has been dead for 5 years. He took whatever secrets he had to the grave." "That is where you are wrong again," Reginald Vivienne countered smoothly. "Dr. Vance may be dead, but his meticulous record-keeping survived. When federal agents raided his safety deposit boxes last month during an investigation into his estate, they found his personal ledgers. He kept detailed notes of every bribe he ever accepted, including the massive payout from you. He even kept the original birth certificate with mine and Harrison's names on it. The paper trail is absolute and undeniable." The federal agent standing behind Trey stepped forward. "Mr. Washington," one of the agents said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of human trafficking, bribery of a medical official, and falsifying federal documents. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Reginald sat perfectly still. The commanding titan of industry was completely gone. He was just a broken old man staring into the terrifying abyss of federal prison. The sudden sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor broke the heavy silence. Heather Trey's beautiful status-obsessed wife scrambled out of her seat. She had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the entire confrontation, desperately trying to shrink into the background. But watching her father-in-law face human trafficking charges and knowing her husband was already in federal custody finally broke her resolve. She stumbled around the table and almost tripped over her expensive heels. She grabbed the sleeve of the lead federal agent, ignoring the way Trey stared at her in utter betrayal. "Wait!" Heather pleaded, her voice shrill and frantic. "You have to listen to me. I can give you everything." "Heather, what are you doing?" Trey hissed, struggling against his restraints. "Shut your mouth right now." Heather spun around and glared at her husband with absolute venom. "I am not going down with this sinking ship. Trey," she screamed at him. "I am not spending the best years of my life visiting you in a federal penitentiary while my assets get frozen and my reputation gets dragged through the mud. You told me the offshore accounts were perfectly legal. You told me the church money was just a temporary loan." She turned back to the federal agent, her manicured hands shaking wildly. "I know where all the physical ledgers are hidden," she begged the agent, her eyes wide with desperation. "I know about the shell companies in Panama and the fake charities Trey used to funnel the church donations. I know which local politicians Reginald has been paying off to keep the building inspectors away from his failing properties. I know everything." The lead federal agent looked down at Heather with a mixture of professional interest and personal distaste. "And what exactly do you want in exchange for this information, Mom?" he asked calmly. "Immunity!" Heather gasped out the word like it was a life preserver. "Full federal immunity for any involvement in the financial crimes. I will sign whatever you want. I will testify against Trey in open court. I will testify against Reginald. I will wear a wire if you need me to. Just promise me I will not go to jail and I will hand you the entire Washington family on a silver platter." The sound of Trey's heartbroken sob echoed through the dining room as he realized his own wife had just sold him out without a second thought. The perfect facade of their wealthy, powerful family had been completely decimated, leaving nothing but ashes and betrayal in its wake. The room fell into a suffocating silence as the pieces of the torn severance agreement fluttered to the floor, settling into the spilled red wine like blood-stained confetti. Heather did not even look at the shredded paper. Her eyes were locked onto the lead federal agent, her chest heaving as she knelt on the expensive rug. She was trembling, but there was a calculating glint in her eyes. She reached into her designer bag again, her manicured fingers pulling out a small leather-bound notebook. She shoved it toward the agent, her voice cracking as she began to spill every dark secret the Washington family had ever buried. "I am telling you I have everything." Heather gasped out her words, tumbling over each other in her desperation. Trey thought he was so smart keeping his digital ledgers encrypted, but he always kept a physical backup, just in case the servers were compromised. This notebook has the routing numbers for the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. It shows exactly how Reginald funneled the church-building fund donations through a maze of shell corporations. He disguised them as charitable grants for urban development, but the money went straight into a trust controlled by Yvonne. Trey let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, as he strained against the agents holding him. "Heather, how could you?" He choked out, tears streaming down his face. "I gave you everything. I bought you that life." Heather spun around to face him, her face twisting into a mask of pure contempt. "You gave me nothing but a house of cards, Trey." She spat back, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You and your father dragged me into this mess. You told me we were royalty in this city. You never told me you were paying off your luxury cars with money stolen from a church congregation. And you, Reginald?" She pointed a shaking finger at my adoptive father, who was still slumped in his chair staring blankly ahead. "You used your own fake charity to launder the bribes you paid to city officials. I have the dates and the amounts written down right here in my own handwriting. I know about the properties you bought under fake names to hide your assets from the IRS. I even know about the dirty money you used to pay off the building inspectors when the foundation of the Onyx Tower started cracking. I am the one who found the paperwork for the fake adoption 24 years ago. I knew you paid that doctor, and I kept quiet because you promised me Trey would inherit the empire. But there is no empire. It is all built on fraud and stolen children and broken lives. Heather turned back to the federal agent, clasping her hands together in a posture of begging. I was just a victim in all of this, she cried, forcing tears to well up in her eyes. I was a naive young woman who married into a family of monsters. I did not know how deep the rot went until it was too late to escape. I will testify to everything I just said on the stand. I will wear a wire to get confessions out of their business partners. Just please tell me I get full immunity. I cannot go to prison. Look at me, I simply cannot survive in a place like that. I stepped forward, the heels of my shoes echoing in the quiet dining room. I looked down at Heather kneeling on the floor surrounded by the shattered pieces of her perfect life. She looked up at me expecting some sort of sisterly solidarity now that she had turned on the men who had ruined both of our lives. You really think you are walking out of here tonight, Heather? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. You have spent the last 5 years making my life a living hell. You treated me like I was dirt beneath your shoes because I was the adopted charity case, and you were the pristine daughter-in-law. You wore diamonds and carried bags paid for by money that was stolen from the very hospital where my biological parents were mourning my fake death. I pulled up another document on my tablet and turned the screen so she could see it clearly. You claim you were just a naive trophy wife? I continued, my tone turning to ice. You claim you had no idea what Trey and Reginald were doing. But this document right here is the registration for a private holding company in your maiden name. Heather's face went completely pale. She stopped crying instantly, the fake tears vanishing as pure terror took over. 3 years ago, Trey transferred $4 million of embezzled church funds into this account, I stated, watching her eyes widen in panic. And you personally signed the transfer forms. You used that stolen money to buy a vacation home in Aspen and to fund your luxury lifestyle brand that never actually sold a single product. You knew exactly what you were doing. You are not a victim, Heather. You are an active co-conspirator. You knew exactly where the money was coming from, and you gladly helped them hide it because you wanted the status more than you wanted a clear conscience. The lead federal agent took the notebook from Heather's, shaking hands, and handed it to one of his deputies. Thank you for the evidence, Mom. The agent said, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. But the Department of Justice does not grant immunity to individuals who actively participated in money laundering and wire fraud. Especially not when we already have all the financial records we need from Miss Washington's holding company. Heather let out a blood-curdling shriek as 2 federal agents stepped forward and grabbed her by the arms, hauling her to her feet. No, she screamed, thrashing wildly against their grip. You cannot do this. I gave you the notebook. I gave you everything. Trey, tell them, I did not know. Reginald, do something. You cannot let them take me. But nobody moved to help her. Trey just watched her with hollow, dead eyes, while the agent snapped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. Her designer dress tore slightly at the shoulder as she fought them, her pristine image completely destroyed as they dragged her toward the dining room doors. You are a monster, Lila, she screamed at me as they pulled her away. You planned this to ruin me. You are just a jealous little orphan who ruined this family. I did not ruin you. Heather, I replied calmly, watching her get dragged into the hallway. You ruined yourself the moment you signed your name to stolen money. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind her, cutting off her frantic screaming. The silence returned, but it was a heavy, suffocating kind of quiet. 3 members of the Washington family were now in federal custody or facing imminent arrest. The invincible empire was nothing but dust. The grand dining room felt like a graveyard for their arrogance. Then a sudden movement caught my eye. Yvonne, my adoptive mother, who had not spoken a single word since Vivienne revealed the truth about the adoption, slowly stood up from her chair. Her face was streaked with running makeup, and her hands were trembling violently. She looked at the empty spaces where her son and daughter-in-law had just been standing, and then she looked at her husband Reginald, who was staring at the floor like a broken man. Yvonne took a step toward Vivienne and me. Her legs wobbled, and she suddenly collapsed, dropping to her knees right in front of us. The woman who had spent 24 years acting like a queen, holding high society galas and judging everyone around her, was now kneeling on the floor in her expensive evening gown, begging for her life. "Please," Yvonne whispered, her voice cracking with raw desperation. "Please, Vivienne, you have to listen to me. I did not know what Reginald did at the hospital. I swear to you I thought it was a legal adoption. He told me the mother had abandoned her and the paperwork was all sealed. I only found out about the bribes years later and I was too terrified to say anything." She reached out and grabbed the hem of Vivienne's coat, her eyes wild and frantic. "I can help you destroy him," Yvonne begged, her voice rising in pitch. "I know where he keeps the safety deposit box keys that are not listed in the corporate ledgers. I know which judges he paid off to win his zoning disputes. I will give you everything. I will testify that he planned the whole thing. I will even disown Trey. I will sign a statement saying I had no part in my son's crimes. Just please let me keep my trust fund. Do not let them put me in a cage. I will give you my husband and my son if you just let me walk away." The absolute desperation in Yvonne's voice hung in the air like a foul stench. I looked down at the woman who had raised me, the woman who had spent the last 2 decades treating me like an inconvenient accessory that never quite matched her designer wardrobe. She was still clutching the hem of Vivienne's coat, her knuckles white, her face twisted into a mask of pure survival instinct. She did not care about Reginald, who was still slumped in his chair looking like a hollow shell of a man. She did not care about Trey, her golden child who was currently being frog-marched out of the country club by federal agents to face a mountain of embezzlement charges. She only cared about preserving her own comfort and avoiding the cold reality of a prison cell. Vivienne looked down at her with an expression of profound disgust. She slowly reached down and peeled Yvonne's manicured fingers off her coat one by one, tossing her hand aside as if it were something contagious. "I am a federal judge," Yvonne Vivienne stated, her voice cold and completely unyielding. "I do not make backroom deals with criminals. You are going to face the full consequences of your complicity in stealing my daughter and funding this sick empire." Yvonne scrambled backward on her knees, her eyes darting frantically around the room until they locked onto me. "Layla," she pleaded, her voice cracking as she abruptly shifted her target. "Layla, my sweet girl, you know I always loved you. I gave you everything you ever needed. I protected you from Reginald when he was in his moods. You cannot let them do this to me." I let out a sharp laugh that echoed against the mahogany walls. The sound was entirely devoid of humor. "Protected me," I repeated, taking a deliberate step closer to her kneeling form. "You spent my entire childhood reminding me that I was a charity case. You made me sleep in the drafty room over the garage while Trey had the entire east wing of the mansion. When I won the state science fair, you did not even show up because you were too busy picking out floral arrangements for your elite country club luncheon. You did not love me, Yvonne. You loved the tax write-off I provided and the sympathetic sighs you got from your socialite friends when you complained about how hard it was to raise a troubled adopted child." "I am sorry," Yvonne sobbed, pressing her hands together in a prayer-like gesture. "I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. But you have the power to stop this civil suit. You bought the debt. You hold all the cards now. Please, Layla, I will give you anything you want. Just name your price." "Anything," I asked, tilting my head slightly as I looked down at her tear-streaked face. "Yes, anything," she gasped, her eyes widening with a sudden desperate spark of hope. "The historic Atlanta mansion, the Buckhead estate. It has been in the Washington family for 4 generations. It is worth at least $12 million on the open market. It is in my name, free and clear from Reginald's corporate holding companies. I will sign it over to you. I will give you the deed, the keys, everything inside it. All the antique furniture, the art collection, the imported rugs. It can all be yours tonight. Just please drop the civil lawsuit against my personal trust fund and tell your mother's federal friends that I was completely ignorant of the fraud. I crossed my arms and pretended to consider her offer. The Buckhead Mansion was the absolute crown jewel of her existence. It was the place where she hosted her elite charity galas, the place where she held court over the local high society. Giving it up was the ultimate sacrifice for a woman whose entire identity was tied to her prestigious zip code and her massive square footage. She was literally offering to surrender her throne if it meant she could avoid wearing an orange jumpsuit. Vivienne stepped up beside me, her presence a silent but powerful anchor. "You do not have to do this, Layla," she murmured softly, keeping her eyes fixed on Yvonne. "We have enough evidence to bury her without any deals." "I know," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on Yvonne. "But this feels incredibly poetic." I looked back at the woman still kneeling on the floor. "Okay, Yvonne," I said, my voice cutting through her pathetic sobs. "I will take the mansion, but we do it right now. No waiting for lawyers tomorrow morning. No stalling tactics. You sign the transfer of deed immediately." Yvonne nodded so fast I thought her neck might snap. "Yes, absolutely right now. Anything you say." I gestured to one of the remaining federal agents who had stayed behind to secure the room. Earlier in the evening, I had my legal team prepare a massive stack of contingency documents just in case the Washington family tried to maneuver their assets during the confrontation. I pulled a crisp white document from my tablet case and placed it on the dining table right next to the puddle of spilled red wine. I handed Yvonne a black fountain pen. "Sign it," I commanded. Yvonne scrambled up from the floor, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the pen. She did not even bother to read the fine print. She just flipped to the last page and hastily scribbled her signature on the dotted line, legally transferring the full ownership of the historic $12 million Buckhead estate directly into my name. She stepped back, letting out a massive breath of relief, acting as if she had just successfully amputated an infected limb to save her own life. There she breathed, wiping the running mascara from under her eyes. "It is done. The house is yours, Layla. You have your revenge. Now please, you have to keep your end of the bargain. Tell them I had nothing to do with Reginald's trafficking or Trey's embezzlement." I picked up the signed document, blowing on the ink for a second to ensure it was completely dry. I carefully folded the paper and slid it into my jacket pocket. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face as I looked at her. "Thank you, Yvonne," I said smoothly. This signature was the very last piece of the puzzle I needed. She frowned, confusion briefly replacing the immense relief on her face. "What do you mean?" "We have a deal." "We did have a deal," I corrected her, taking a step back toward Vivienne. "You offered me the Buckhead Mansion in exchange for dropping the civil suit against your trust fund. And I accepted the house. But the thing is, Yvonne, you should really pay closer attention to your husband's frantic financial maneuverings." Reginald, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, suddenly let out a pathetic strangled groan. He closed his eyes and let his head fall forward onto the hard wooden table. Yvonne looked at him, panic rising in her throat all over again. "Reginald, what is she talking about?" I tapped my tablet screen one last time and turned it toward her. "You see, Yvonne," I explained, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Reginald did not just use the church funds to pay the interest on his commercial real estate loans. When the bank started breathing down his neck 6 months ago, he quietly took out a massive secondary mortgage on the Buckhead Mansion to cover his margin calls. He leveraged the house to the absolute limit without telling you." Yvonne stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing silently as she read the bleak financial summary. "And since you just legally transferred the deed into my name," I continued, watching the absolute horror dawn on her face, "you also transferred all the liabilities tied to it. Which means your personal trust fund is no longer protected by the marital asset shield. But that is not even the best part. The second mortgage has been in default for 90 days. The Buckhead Mansion is officially slated for foreclosure tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. You just gave me a worthless, heavily indebted property, which means our deal is completely void, and the federal agents are still going to seize every single penny in your personal accounts. The blood completely drained from Yvonne's face, leaving her looking like a hollow porcelain doll. She stared at the signed document in my hand and then looked at the federal agents who were already stepping forward to secure the room. She let out a sound that was less human and more like a wounded animal. The realization that she had just traded her most prized possession for absolutely nothing shattered whatever fragile grip she still had on her sanity. She fell forward, her manicured hands slapping against the cold hardwood floor, her expensive gown soaking up the spilled red wine. The federal agents did not show a single ounce of pity as they watched the disgraced matriarch crumble. Vivienne looked down at the sobbing woman with eyes as cold as glaciers. "You built your entire life on a foundation of stolen money and stolen children," Vivienne said softly. "Did you really think the universe would let you keep the spoils?" Reginald tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He was a titan of industry, a man who had intimidated mayors and crushed small businesses without a second thought. But now he was just a pathetic old man waiting for his handcuffs. He had destroyed his wife's sanctuary without telling her, and now she was going down with his sinking ship. Then the oppressive silence of the dining room was shattered by a sound that would become the soundtrack to their ultimate destruction. Yvonne's diamond-encrusted smartphone resting near the edge of the table began to buzz. It was a persistent, frantic vibration. A second later, Reginald's phone buzzed from inside his jacket pocket. Then the federal agent's devices pinged simultaneously. The news was out. Heather had not just surrendered the physical ledgers and confessed to the FBI. In her final act of spite before being dragged away, she had sent a mass digital broadcast. She had forwarded the court filings, the arrest warrants, and the details of the offshore accounts to the entire Atlanta elite social registry. The dark secrets of the Washington family were currently lighting up the group chats of every billionaire politician, charity director, and socialite in the city. Yvonne scrambled off the floor, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the glowing screen. Her face twisted into a mask of pure agony as she read the notifications pouring in. It was a complete and total social slaughter happening in real time. "No," she whispered, tapping the screen frantically. "No, no, no, this cannot be happening. Clarissa, please, you have to let me explain." I walked around the table looking over her shoulder. The president of the Daughters of Southern Heritage had sent a terse message stating Yvonne's lifetime membership was revoked effective immediately. The chairwoman of the Children's Hospital Gala, the very same hospital where Reginald had paid the bribe to fake my death, texted to say Yvonne was permanently banned from all future events and that security had been given her photograph. Her elite sorority sisters, women she had vacationed with in the Hamptons and gossiped with over champagne, were removing her from their exclusive group chats one by one, right before her eyes. "They are blocking me!" Yvonne cried out, her voice bordering on hysterical. "They are all blocking me. Women I have known for 30 years are treating me like I am diseased." "They are treating you exactly how you treated me," I replied, keeping my voice completely level. "You taught me that love and acceptance in this circle were entirely conditional, based on wealth and status. You set the rules, Yvonne. You cannot cry now that your friends are playing by them." Reginald pulled his phone from his pocket, his hands trembling so badly he dropped it on the table. The screen lit up with notifications from his board of directors, his investors, and his bankers. Lines of credit were being frozen. Emergency board meetings were being convened to strip him of his titles. The massive empire was dissolving into digital dust. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room suddenly swung open. Mr. Sterling, the general manager of the elite country club, walked into the room. He was a tall, distinguished man who usually bowed and scraped whenever the Washingtons arrived, ensuring they had the best tables and the finest vintage wines. But tonight, his posture was completely different. His face was set in a mask of rigid professional disdain. He looked at the federal agents, the spilled wine, and finally at Yvonne and Reginald. "Mr. Washington, Mrs. Washington," he said, his voice clipped and entirely devoid of its usual warmth. It has come to the attention of the Board of Directors that you are currently the subjects of a federal criminal investigation involving severe financial fraud and human trafficking. Reginald tried to muster his old authoritative tone. "Sterling, please," he croaked out, struggling to sit up straight. "We have been premium members here for 20 years. I personally funded the renovation of the championship golf course. You cannot just throw us out based on unproven allegations. We demand respect." "They are not unproven," Reginald Mr. Sterling replied, gesturing toward the federal agents who were now pulling out their handcuffs. "And our club has a very strict morality and character clause. The board convened an emergency virtual meeting 5 minutes ago when the news broke. Your presence here is a massive liability to the reputation of this establishment. We have high-profile guests who expect a certain caliber of company, and quite frankly, you no longer meet those standards." Yvonne let out a loud gasp of sheer horror. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her heavy platinum diamond-encrusted lifetime membership card. She held it up with shaking hands as if it were a shield against the terrifying reality of her situation. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am a founding member of the Ladies' Auxiliary Committee. I practically built the social calendar for this club. I belong here. I am Yvonne Washington." Mr. Sterling did not blink. He stepped forward and smoothly plucked the heavy platinum card right out of Yvonne's trembling fingers. He then reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty silver shears. Yvonne watched in absolute disbelief as he positioned the sharp metal blades directly over the center of her precious membership card. The crisp, sharp sound of the metal cutting through the thick plastic echoed loudly in the quiet room. The two halves of the card fell directly into the puddle of spilled wine, joining the shredded pieces of my severance agreement. The two halves of the platinum card sank into the dark red puddle of wine resting right next to the shredded pieces of my severance agreement. Yvonne let out a hollow gasping sound as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the room. She slumped onto the floor, her hands hovering over the ruined plastic, unable to even touch it. Mr. Sterling did not spare her a second glance. He simply turned on his heel and walked out of the room, leaving the door wide open for the federal agents to finish their business. The lead agent stepped up to the table, his expression hardened into professional indifference. "Reginald Washington, you are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, and violation of the Racketeer, Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act," the agent recited smoothly. Reginald's eyes were wide and unfocused. The commanding titan of Atlanta real estate, the man who had terrified me for my entire childhood, was entirely gone. He did not even try to fight as the agent grabbed his arms and wrenched them behind his back. The sharp click of the steel handcuffs echoed through the dining room, sounding like the final gavel dropping on the Washington legacy. Trey was not nearly as quiet. When the second agent approached him, he began to thrash wildly, his chair scraping backward across the hardwood floor. "You cannot do this to me!" Trey screamed, tears streaming down his perfectly groomed face. "I am the victim here. My father made me do it. He forced me to sign those papers. I did not know where the church money was going." The federal agent shoved Trey face first against the mahogany table, pinning his cheek right next to the spilled wine. "Save it for the judge," the agent said coldly, locking the cuffs around Trey's wrists so tightly that Trey let out a yelp of pain. "Your digital signature is on every single offshore transfer. You were not just following orders, Trey, you were directing the traffic." I watched the two men, the architects of my misery, being hauled to their feet. They looked pathetic. Their expensive tailored suits were rumpled, their faces pale and sweating. Reginald refused to look at me, keeping his eyes glued to the floor as they marched him toward the exit. Trey, however, twisted his neck to glare at me one last time. "You ruined us, Layla." He spat, his voice thick with venom. "You came into our house and you ruined us." "I did not ruin you, Trey," I answered, my voice perfectly calm, carrying through the silent room. "Your own greed ruined you. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the rot." As the agents dragged the two men out into the hallway, The chaos of the night seemed to peak. Local police officers had arrived to assist the federal agents establishing a secure perimeter around the entire country club. Sirens wailed in the distance, echoing through the dark Atlanta night. The pristine hallways of the exclusive club were swarming with law enforcement personnel. It was during this massive commotion that Heather made her final, desperate play. She had been placed in a temporary holding parlor just down the hall, supervised by a single junior agent, while the senior officers dealt with Reginald and Trey. But Heather had spent her entire life slipping through the cracks of consequence. Seeing the junior agent momentarily distracted by the influx of local police stepping into the room, Heather quietly slipped her bare feet out of her discarded designer heels. Leaving the expensive shoes behind, she vanished down a dimly lit service corridor, moving with the silent, desperate speed of a cornered animal. I stood in the dining room watching the fallout when Vivienne touched my arm. "Where is Heather?" she asked, her brow furrowing in suspicion. "She was just in the holding parlor, but the officers are saying the room is completely empty." My heart gave a sharp jolt. The country club was a massive, sprawling estate built with dozens of hidden service hallways intended for the catering staff to move unseen. Heather knew the layout of this club better than anyone in the building. She had spent years planning elite charity balls and high society luncheons here. She knew exactly where the security camera blind spots were, and more importantly, she knew exactly which exit led to the unmonitored delivery roads at the back of the property. "She is going for the loading dock," I said, moving quickly toward the service doors at the back of the dining room. "She still has her passport in her designer bag. She thinks she can hail a private car and get to the regional airport before her name hits the federal no-fly list." Vivienne and I hurried down the narrow service corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The path was a winding maze of stainless steel prep kitchens and dry storage rooms, but we kept moving toward the heavy metal doors that marked the rear delivery exit. I could almost picture Heather sprinting through the dark, desperately clinging to the delusion that she could outrun a massive federal indictment. Outside in the humid night air, Heather was indeed making her break for it. She had managed to push open the heavy service doors, stepping out onto the raised concrete loading dock. The delivery driveway was empty and shrouded in thick shadows. Freedom was just a few dozen yards away down the asphalt ramp. She let out a ragged breath of relief, clutching her bag tightly to her chest, ready to sprint barefoot into the darkness. But as she stepped to the edge of the concrete platform, a solid wall of black SUVs suddenly pulled out from the tree line, blocking the entire driveway. The high beams flicked on blindingly bright, pinning Heather in the spotlight like a deer caught in the headlights. Heather froze, her face twisting in absolute horror as the doors of the heavy vehicles swung open in perfect unison. Half a dozen massive men stepped out dressed in immaculate tactical suits. They did not look like regular police officers. They moved with a precise, terrifying military coordination. They were Harrison's private security detail, the elite team that my biological father employed to protect his corporate assets globally. And they had been quietly locking down the perimeter of the country club all evening, waiting for exactly this kind of rat to scurry out of the sinking ship. The head of the security team, a towering man with a completely unreadable expression, stepped forward and blocked Heather's only escape path. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Washington?" he asked, his voice a deep, menacing rumble over the idling engines. "Get out of my way!" Heather shrieked, trying to push past him. Her hand slammed against his chest, but it was like hitting a brick wall. He did not even budge an inch. "You have no jurisdiction over me," she screamed, panic entirely consuming her perfectly curated composure. "I have a private car coming. You cannot legally hold me here." "Actually, Mom, we have been fully authorized to detain any fleeing suspects by the federal agents inside," the security chief replied calmly, reaching into his dark jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up to the blinding headlights. "Besides, you are not just running from a local embezzlement charge anymore." Heather's eyes darted frantically side to side, searching for any possible escape route, but she was completely surrounded by the towering security team. "What are you talking about?" she gasped, her breathing ragged and shallow. "I told them I was just a victim. I gave them the physical ledger." The security chief grabbed her by the arm, his grip like a steel vise. The federal agents just finished processing your offshore holding companies. He explained, his tone completely flat and unforgiving. They found the digital trail connecting your boutique lifestyle brand to a series of fraudulent wire transfers across 6 different state lines. You were not just hiding your husband's stolen money, Heather. You were actively laundering it through fake corporate vendors in Florida and Texas. You are wanted for interstate wire fraud. Heather let out a devastating scream of pure defeat, her knees buckling beneath her. Vivian and I stepped out onto the loading dock, just in time to watch Harrison's men hand a sobbing, hysterical Heather over to the approaching federal agents. The perfect daughter-in-law was finally facing the absolute end of her pristine facade, the heavy metal cuffs snapping around her wrists once again as the wailing police sirens closed in around her. Vivian and I walked slowly back through the winding service corridors, leaving the flashing red and blue lights behind us in the loading dock. The heavy silence of the country club felt entirely different now. The oppressive weight of the Washington family, the suffocating atmosphere of their lies, had been completely lifted. We stepped back into the private dining room, where the air still smelled faintly of the spilled Cabernet and expensive cologne. Yvonne was sitting on the floor right where we had left her. She looked like a discarded marionette whose strings had been abruptly cut. Her flawless evening gown was hopelessly stained with dark red wine. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a tangled, frantic mess, and the shredded remains of her platinum country club card lay in the puddle just inches from her knees. The federal agents had cleared out, taking Reginald and Trey with them to booking. The only people left in the massive opulent room were the 3 of us. Yvonne slowly lifted her head as she heard our footsteps clicking against the hardwood. Her eyes were bloodshot, the makeup running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She was completely devoid of the calculated grace and icy elegance she had weaponized against me for decades. When she looked at me, her despair instantly morphed into a toxic, venomous hatred. She struggled to her feet, her designer heels slipping slightly on the slick floor. She had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to keep herself standing upright. "You think you have won?" She hissed, her voice raspy and shaking with pure, unadulterated malice. "You think because you took my house and my money and my family that you are somehow better than us? You are nothing, Layla. You hear me? You are absolutely nothing. You were a broken, traumatized little orphan when Reginald brought you home, and you are still just a broken, unloved child now." She took a stumbling step forward, pointing a trembling finger right at my chest. Her face was contorted with a desperate need to inflict pain. "We gave you a name because nobody else in the world wanted you," she spat. "We gave you a life because you were garbage without us. You can strip away every dollar I have, you can send my husband to a federal penitentiary, but you will never belong anywhere. You will always be the fake daughter. The charity case we kept around for good public relations. The girl who has to buy her way into a family because her own mother threw her away like trash." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic words wash over me. For 24 years, that exact speech would have shattered my soul and sent me crying into the dark corner of the room over the garage. It was the exact fear that had kept me obedient and compliant my entire life. But tonight, looking at this pathetic, ruined woman, her words held absolutely no power. Before I could even open my mouth to reply, Vivian stepped smoothly in front of me, physically shielding me from Yvonne's venomous glare. "You do not get to speak to my daughter that way ever again," Vivian said, her voice echoing with the terrifying absolute authority of a mother who had finally found her stolen child. Yvonne flinched physically, stepping back as Vivian closed the distance between them. "You did not save her," Vivian continued, her tone dropping to a lethal, furious whisper. "You kidnapped her. You bought her from a corrupt doctor because you needed a human prop for your miserable, empty lives. She was never a charity case. She was the most loved, wanted, and cherished child in the world, and every single day for 24 years, my husband and I have grieved her absence." Vivienne reached into her sleek briefcase and pulled out a thick blue legal folder. She tossed it onto the table right over the spilled wine. The heavy thud of the documents seemed to make Yvonne jump. "I filed the paperwork with the state Supreme Court this morning," Vivian stated coldly. "The fraudulent adoption orchestrated by your criminal husband has been officially nullified. The state has formally recognized the abduction. Her name is not Layla Washington. Her legal birth certificate has been fully restored. Her name is Clara Harrison. She is my daughter. She is the sole heir to the Harrison family legacy, and she belongs exactly where she has always belonged, with the people who never stopped loving her." Yvonne stared at the blue folder as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. She shook her head slowly side to side, trying to deny the reality crashing down around her. Vivian was relentless, refusing to give the woman an inch of mercy. "You called her a broken, unloved child?" Vivienne said. Her eyes locked onto Yvonne's pale, terrified face. "You tried to make her feel like she had nothing. But my husband and I never stopped hoping. The day Clara was born, we established a generational trust fund in her true name. When that corrupt hospital administration told us she had died due to sudden complications, we refused to dissolve the accounts. We kept funding it every single year on her birthday, hoping against hope that there had been some terrible mistake." Vivienne took a step closer, forcing Yvonne to retreat until her back hit the wall. "For 24 years, that money has been sitting in a high-yield investment portfolio untouched and accumulating massive compound interest." Vivienne explained, her voice ringing with finality. "It is currently valued at over $85 million. Clara does not need your stolen wealth, Yvonne. She never needed your fake charity or your conditional affection. She is independently wealthier than your entire fraudulent empire ever was, and the money she possesses is actually clean." Yvonne let out a breathless, pathetic whimpering sound, sliding slowly down the wall until she was slumped against the baseboards. She had nothing left: no husband, no son, no mansion, no country club status, and no high society friends. And now she was forced to realize that the girl she had treated like a peasant for 2 decades was actually royalty. The psychological defeat was absolute. I stepped out from behind my mother, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my entire being. The nightmare was finally over. I reached into my purse and pulled out the leather-bound checkbook the waiter had left on the edge of the table, what felt like a lifetime ago. I opened it and slid the crisp white receipt out from under the brass clip. I walked over to Yvonne and gently pressed the paper against her chest, letting it flutter down into her trembling lap. "Since your credit lines are frozen and your assets are seized, I suggest you figure out how to wash dishes very quickly," I said quietly, looking down at her one last time. "That is the $5,000 bill for tonight's celebration dinner, and it is all yours." The morning air was crisp and completely still as the convoy of heavy vehicles turned onto the long, winding driveway of the Buckhead estate. The dashboard clock in my SUV read exactly 8 a.m. We were right on time. Behind my vehicle, a line of 3 massive commercial moving trucks followed closely, flanked by 2 local sheriff cruisers. Vivian sat beside me, perfectly composed, sipping her black coffee. We watched the towering columns of the Washington family mansion come into view. This was the house where I had spent years shrinking into the background, the place where I had been treated like an unwanted ghost. Today, I was returning as the landlord. The SUVs came to a halt on the circular driveway. I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestones, smoothing down the front of my tailored charcoal suit. The sheriff stepped out of his cruiser, holding a thick stack of legal documents. We walked up the grand marble steps together. I did not even bother pressing the ornate brass doorbell. The sheriff simply knocked twice with a heavy fist and then used the bank-issued master key to unlock the massive double doors. The scene inside the grand foyer was absolute chaos. The usually immaculate house looked like a war zone. Half-packed cardboard boxes were scattered across the imported marble floors. Priceless vases and silver frames were shoved haphazardly into garbage bags. And in the center of the frantic mess stood Yvonne. She was wearing wrinkled silk pajamas, her hair unbrushed and her face pale and exhausted. She looked up as the heavy doors swung open and the color completely drained from her face. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, dropping a stack of velvet jewelry boxes onto the floor. "You have no right to just walk into my home. Get out before I call the police." I gestured to the two uniformed sheriffs standing right behind me. "The police are already here, Yvonne," I said, my voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "And this is no longer your home." She blinked rapidly, clutching her silk robe tightly around her chest. "What are you talking about?" "I have 30 days to vacate. My lawyer told me the foreclosure process takes months." "Your lawyer clearly did not read the fine print of the secondary mortgage contract your husband signed," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate step into the foyer. The loan carried an expedited seizure clause in the event of federal criminal charges. When Reginald was arrested last night, the bank activated the clause. The property went into immediate receivership at exactly 8 a.m., and since I own the majority of your husband's commercial debt, the bank gladly transferred the immediate possession rights directly to me. I waved my hand toward the open front doors. The moving crew, clad in matching gray uniforms, began streaming into the house. They carried heavy-duty dollies and thick rolls of packing tape. They moved with ruthless mechanical efficiency, immediately wrapping a protective blanket around a priceless Ming vase and wheeling away a velvet chaise lounge. Yvonne let out a breathless, horrified scream. "Stop it!" she cried out, lunging forward to grab the arm of a mover who was currently unhooking a massive crystal chandelier. "Put that down! These are family heirlooms. You are stealing from me." The sheriff stepped in front of her, holding up a firm hand. "Mom, you need to step back," he stated calmly. "This is a court-ordered eviction and asset seizure. Everything inside this property is now under the legal possession of the debt holder." Yvonne stumbled backward, her chest heaving as she watched her entire material life being dismantled and carried out the front door. The antique mirrors, the Persian rugs, the custom silk drapes. Everything she had used to build her fragile elite identity was being stripped away. She spun around, her eyes wide and frantic, darting toward the grand winding staircase. "Wait!" she gasped, her bare feet slipping slightly on the marble floor. "My personal items, my wardrobe. The bank cannot take my personal clothing." Before the sheriff could stop her, Yvonne bolted up the carpeted stairs. We followed at a steady pace, listening to the sounds of drawers being ripped open and hangers crashing to the floor in the master suite. By the time we reached the top of the stairs, Yvonne was dragging herself out of the master bedroom. She was completely weighed down by a massive, chaotic pile of leather and hardware. She was clutching at least a dozen extremely rare designer handbags to her chest. There were brightly colored Hermes Birkins, classic quilted Chanel flaps, and exotic crocodile skin totes. She was hugging them to her body as if they were actual children, her knuckles white from gripping the expensive leather so tightly. "These are mine," she sobbed, her voice cracking as she backed away from me toward the landing. "They are my personal accessories. You cannot touch them. They are exempt from the property seizure. I know my rights. I am leaving with these." I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked at the pathetic woman hiding behind a barricade of overpriced leather. She was practically shaking, terrified of losing her final connection to high society. The bags were her status symbols, the items she paraded around the country club to prove she was better than everyone else. I slowly pulled a sleek digital tablet from my briefcase. I tapped the screen a few times, bringing up a highly detailed forensic accounting document. I did not even look at her as I began to read the highlighted sections. "You know, Yvonne," I said, my voice perfectly conversational. "When Vivian's investigators began unraveling Reginald's offshore accounts, last night they found something incredibly interesting. They found out exactly how you managed to fund your extravagant personal shopping sprees without triggering alerts on the corporate ledgers." Yvonne froze, her eyes darting to the tablet. "I bought those bags with my own allowance," she stammered defensively. "No, you did not," I replied, looking up and locking eyes with her. "When you and Reginald bought me from that corrupt doctor, you did not just steal a child to use as a tax write-off. You also harvested my identity. You took my new fake social security number, the one you created for Layla Washington, and you used it to open dozens of shadow credit accounts. You used a child's stolen identity to build a pristine hidden credit score. Yvonne swallowed hard, the heavy bag slipping slightly in her grasp. I tapped the screen again. I have the full forensic trace right here. I continued, stepping closer to her. Every single one of those designer bags you are currently hugging was purchased using a platinum black card issued under my social security number. You committed identity theft against your own fake adopted daughter just to buy limited edition purses. She shook her head frantically, tears spilling down her face. No, that is not true. Reginald handled the finances. I did not know where the money came from. It does not matter if you knew, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute whisper. The fact remains that those bags were purchased using my legal identity and my stolen credit, which means under the law they do not belong to you. They are legally my property. The sheriff stepped forward, his face hardened with disgust as he reached out toward Yvonne. Hand over the merchandise, Mom, he ordered. Yvonne let out a gut-wrenching wail. She tried to twist away, but the sheriff firmly grabbed the handles of the bags and yanked them out of her arms. The heavy leather purses cascaded onto the carpeted floor in a messy, colorful pile. Yvonne collapsed onto her knees, weeping uncontrollably as her final pieces of luxury were stripped away. I reached down and picked up a pristine white crocodile Birkin bag. I examined the flawless stitching for a second before tossing it casually to one of the moving crew. Throw it in the truck, I instructed, not caring if the expensive leather got scuffed. I looked down at Yvonne, who was now sobbing into her hands on the floor of the empty hallway. You have exactly 10 minutes to exit my house, I told her quietly. If you are still inside when the clock strikes 8:30, the sheriff will arrest you for criminal trespassing. The grandfather clock in the downstairs parlor began to chime, echoing loudly through the chaotic house. Yvonne remained a crumpled, weeping mess on the carpet, completely unable to process the reality that her 10-minute warning was rapidly ticking away. The moving crew simply stepped over her, carefully maneuvering a massive antique vanity down the hallway. I watched her for another moment, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow closure before the sound of shouting erupted from the main foyer below. This is private property and you have no right to block my entrance. A booming, authoritative male voice echoed up the grand staircase. Do you have any idea who I am? I demand to speak to whoever is in charge of this absolute circus right now. I walked to the edge of the upstairs landing and looked down into the foyer. Pushing past the local sheriff's deputies were two people who radiated old Southern wealth and unchecked privilege. It was Arthur and Penelope St. Clair Heather's parents. Arthur was a tall, red-faced man, wearing a custom-tailored cashmere overcoat and a scowl that usually sent his employees running for cover. Penelope trailed right behind him, clutching a designer handbag that cost more than most people's cars. Her face pinched into a mask of pure aristocratic outrage. They had clearly just rushed over from their own sprawling estate, likely after receiving a frantic, panicked phone call from their daughter inside a federal holding cell. Arthur marched into the center of the foyer, his expensive leather shoes crunching over the packing tape and bubble wrap discarded by the movers. He spotted Yvonne sobbing at the top of the stairs and let out a disgusted sigh. Yvonne, pull yourself together, he barked, completely ignoring her obvious distress. Where is Reginald? My daughter is sitting in a concrete cell downtown right now, and your idiot son is nowhere to be found. I have my legal team trying to post bail, but the federal judge is denying it. What is going on here? Yvonne could only let out a pathetic wailing sound, unable to form actual words. Arthur rolled his eyes and finally looked up past her, locking his furious gaze directly onto me. He had only met me a handful of times over the years, usually at crowded country club galas where he treated me like the hired help, but he clearly knew exactly who I was now. Heather must have told him that the quiet adopted charity case was the one who had triggered the federal raid. You, he growled, pointing a thick manicured finger up at me. You are the little ungrateful brat who caused this mess. I do not know what kind of fabricated evidence you handed over to the feds, but you have made a massive mistake, little girl. You are playing a game you cannot possibly win. I slowly began to descend the marble stairs, my footsteps echoing softly. Vivienne walked right beside me, her presence a silent, unyielding wall of support. I am not playing a game. Arthur, I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady, reaching the middle landing so I was looking down at him. I just handed over the actual financial ledgers. Your daughter built a massive money laundering operation using shell companies and stolen identities. She is facing decades in a federal prison, and there is no amount of old money privilege that can bail her out of this one. Penelope pushed past her husband, her eyes flashing with absolute venom. How dare you speak about my daughter that way? She shrieked, her carefully maintained socialite voice cracking into a shrill screech. Heather is a delicate, well-bred girl. She was manipulated by that thug Trey and his corrupt father. She is an innocent victim in all of this. You are just a jealous, bitter orphan who has always hated our family because you will never belong in our world. We are the St. Clairs. We have the best lawyers in the entire state of Georgia on speed dial. My husband is going to bury you in so much litigation you will be begging to live back in that room over the garage. Arthur nodded, puffing out his chest, trying to use his sheer physical presence to intimidate me. He was a man who was used to bullying his way out of every consequence, throwing his money and status around, until people simply gave up and walked away. My wife is right, he stated, stepping up to the bottom of the stairs. You are going to call the federal prosecutor right now, and you are going to retract every single lie you told about Heather. If you do not, I swear to you, I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life paying for this. I will crush you. I stopped on the third step, looking down at the arrogant, wealthy couple who thought they were entirely untouchable. They had spent their whole lives believing that the rules did not apply to them simply because their bank accounts were full. I smiled a slow, cold smile that made Arthur's confident scowl falter just a fraction. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I walked down the final 3 steps, closing the distance between us. Arthur tried to take a step back, but the sheriff's deputies had moved in closer, blocking his exit path. I held the envelope out toward his chest. When he refused to raise his hands, I simply pressed the thick paper against his expensive cashmere coat until instinct forced him to grab it so it would not fall. "What is this garbage?" he demanded, looking down at the envelope as if it were contaminated. "That is not garbage, Arthur," I replied, crossing my arms and tilting my head. "That is a civil lawsuit and a federal subpoena. You see, when Vivienne's forensic accountants were tracking the money moving through Heather's fake corporate vendors, they noticed something very interesting about the initial seed capital. Heather did not use Reginald's money to start the fraudulent shell companies. She used a massive wire transfer from a blind family trust to cover the initial startup costs." Penelope's face instantly went completely white. She grabbed her husband's arm, her manicured fingers digging into his sleeve. Arthur stared at the envelope in his hands, his mouth opening and closing silently. And according to the banking records, I continued, keeping my voice smooth and relentless. "You are the sole managing executor of that specific trust, Arthur, which means you personally authorized the transfer of millions of dollars to fund an illegal racketeering enterprise. You did not just raise a criminal, you bankrolled her." Arthur frantically tore open the envelope, ripping the paper in his haste. He pulled out the legal documents, his eyes darting frantically over the bold black text on the first page. His hands began to shake so violently that the papers rattled loudly in the quiet foyer. "You are officially named as a co-conspirator in a federal racketeering and wire fraud investigation," I explained, watching the absolute terror completely erase his arrogant facade. "The federal judge signed the asset freeze 30 minutes ago. Your offshore accounts, your domestic portfolios, your hedge funds, and your precious country club estate are all locked down. You cannot even buy a cup of coffee right now without federal approval. You came here to bully me, Arthur, but you should have stayed home and packed your bags because the FBI is currently serving a search warrant at your house too." Arthur dropped the heavy manila envelope as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. His face went from a furious crimson to a sickly pale white in a matter of seconds. Penelope let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. All of their arrogant bluster, all of their inherited Southern charm completely evaporated. They were no longer the untouchable elite of Buckhead. They were just two terrified criminals realizing the walls were closing in. Arthur grabbed his wife's arm and dragged her toward the open front doors, slipping on the marble floor in his haste to escape. They did not say another word to me or to Yvonne, who was still sobbing quietly against the baseboards. They just ran to their luxury SUV, desperate to salvage whatever was left of their crumbling empire. I watched their cars speed away down the long driveway, sending gravel flying into the manicured grass. Vivienne stepped up beside me and placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. She did not need to speak. The silence in the grand foyer was finally peaceful. The moving crew continued their work, methodically emptying the mansion of every stolen luxury. Within an hour, the house that had been my prison for 2 decades was completely stripped bare. The echoing halls were empty of the Washington family legacy. My cell phone vibrated heavily in my suit pocket, breaking the quiet stillness. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an automated collect call from the Federal Detention Center downtown. I stared at the incoming number for a moment, feeling a cold sense of anticipation wash over me. I tapped the screen to accept the charges and pressed the speaker icon. I also reached into my briefcase and activated the digital audio recorder on my tablet. "Lila, please tell me you are there." Trey's voice came through the speaker. He sounded completely frantic, his usual arrogant swagger entirely replaced by raw desperation. The background noise of the holding facility echoed behind him, the sounds of slamming metal doors and shouting guards making him speak louder. "I am here, Trey," I answered, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion. "Listen to me, you have to help me," he pleaded, his breath hitching. "They raided the house last night. They took my dad in handcuffs and then they dragged me out of bed. I'm sitting in a concrete cell with 20 other guys. My lawyer says the bail is set at $2 million and all of our family accounts are frozen. I cannot get a hold of my mom or Heather. I need you to wire the bail money to my attorney right now. I know you have access to funds. You have to do this for me, Layla. We are family." I looked at Vivienne, who simply crossed her arms and listened. The sheer audacity of this boy was astounding. After years of treating me like dirt, he still expected me to play the role of the obedient little sister the moment he snapped his fingers. "Why would I pay $2 million to bail you out, Trey?" I asked, my tone perfectly conversational. "I need to know exactly what I am paying for. What exactly did the federal agents charge you with?" He let out a frustrated groan, hitting the wall of his cell or a phone booth. "It is a massive misunderstanding," he stammered. "They are claiming I helped Heather run her corporate vendor scheme. They think I was the one moving the money through the offshore accounts and setting up the fake tax documents." "And did you?" I pressed, making sure the tablet was picking up every single word of his frantic voice. "The federal prosecutor is going to need a lot more than just suspicions to hold you on a $2 million bond. They must have found the ledgers, Trey. They must have found the paper trail connecting you to my stolen identity." There was a heavy silence on the line for a few seconds. Trey was weighing his options. He was a coward who always folded under pressure. And right now, he was terrified of spending another minute in federal lockup. He thought if he just came clean to me, I would pity him enough to authorize the wire transfer. "Okay, fine," he breathed, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "Yes. I set up the shell companies for Heather. My dad showed me how to structure the dummy corporations so they would bypass the standard bank audits. Heather brought in the initial capital from her parents' trust fund, and I used your social security number to open the shadow credit lines. We needed a clean identity to secure the commercial leases without tying it back to the Washington family assets. I signed your name on the federal tax returns to hide the money laundering. I did it all, but it was my dad's idea, I swear. He told me you were just a prop anyway, and that we might as well use your clean credit score to build out the portfolio." I let his confession hang in the empty foyer. He had just admitted to wire fraud, identity theft, tax evasion, and money laundering, all on a recorded line. He had implicated himself, his father, and Heather in one continuous desperate breath. "Layla, please," Trey begged, his voice breaking. "I told you the truth. I am sorry. Okay? I am so sorry we used your name. Just please call the lawyer and transfer the bail money. I cannot stay in this place. You have to save me." I picked up my tablet and stopped the recording. I quickly attached the audio file to a new email addressed directly to the lead federal prosecutor handling the Washington racketeering case. "I am not going to save you, Trey," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal calm. "You stole my identity. You treated me like an unwanted stray dog while you used my name to fund your pathetic criminal lifestyle. You thought I was weak and stupid, but you just confessed to multiple federal felonies on a recorded line." "What are you talking about?" he gasped, the panic returning with terrifying force. "Layla, what did you do?" "I just forwarded your entire confession to the district attorney," I replied, watching the progress bar on my email hit 100%. The message sent successfully. "You wanted to know why your bail was set so high, Trey. It is because they already had the bank records. But now they have your sworn recorded confession to wrap it all up with a nice, neat bow. You are not getting out today, Trey. You are never getting out." "Layla, wait! No, please, you cannot do this to me!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the phone speaker. I could hear the utter despair tearing his throat apart. I tapped the red button on the screen and disconnected the call. The sudden silence in the grand foyer was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I slid the phone back into my pocket and looked at Vivian, who was smiling with absolute fierce pride. The eviction was complete. The money was reclaimed. The criminals were securely locked in cages of their own making. I turned my back on the empty Washington mansion and walked out the front doors, stepping into the bright morning sunlight to start my real life. The morning sun felt incredibly warm against my skin as I walked down the marble steps of the Washington estate for the absolute final time. The heavy oak doors closed behind me, sealing away 24 years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and stolen identity. I slid into the passenger seat of Vivian's waiting black SUV. She put the car in drive, and we pulled away from the circular driveway, leaving the moving trucks and the flashing police lights in our rearview mirror. I did not look back even once. We drove in a comfortable, companionable silence toward downtown Atlanta. The city skyline grew larger through the tinted windows, reflecting the bright morning light. We pulled into the underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper. This was the headquarters of the Harrison Family Legal Trust. Vivian led me into a private elevator that shot us up to the penthouse level. The doors opened into a massive sunlit boardroom overlooking the entire city. A distinguished-looking man with silver hair was waiting for us at the end of a long mahogany conference table. Vivian introduced him as Judge Lawrence, a longtime family friend and the federal magistrate who had expedited the unsealing of my birth records. Laid out on the polished wood table was a thick stack of ivory legal paper. The documents were bound with a dark blue ribbon. "We have everything ready," the judge said, his voice warm and respectful. The fraud charges against the Washingtons allowed us to bypass the standard waiting periods. Your original birth certificate has been fully reinstated and the adoption has been officially nullified. All we need now is your final signature to legally reclaim your true identity. Vivian stood beside me and placed a heavy gold fountain pen onto the table. For a moment, I just stared at the blank signature line. My hand hovered over the paper. For my entire life, I had been Layla Washington. That name had been a heavy iron chain around my neck. It was a constant reminder that I was a purchased prop. A charity case kept around to make Reginald and Yvonne look like generous philanthropists. That name carried the weight of 1,000 insults, the sting of being forced to sit at the end of the table, the humiliation of wearing Heather's discarded clothes. I picked up the gold pen. It felt heavy and substantial in my grip. I pressed the metal tip to the thick ivory paper and began to write. I did not hesitate. I signed the name Clara Harrison with strong, fluid strokes. The moment the ink dried, I felt a physical shift in my chest. It was as if a crushing pressure had instantly evaporated from my lungs. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer an orphan. I was Clara Harrison, the sole heir to a generational empire and a woman who had just single-handedly dismantled the criminals who stole her. Vivienne wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into a fierce emotional embrace. "Welcome home, Clara," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "It is so incredibly good to finally meet you." I hugged my mother back, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my entire being. The legal transition was complete. My bank accounts, my business licenses, my passports, everything was being updated in real time to reflect my true identity. The Harrison Trust funds had already been merged with my personal M&A firm accounts, creating a financial portfolio so massive it dwarfed the entire Washington enterprise tenfold. After leaving the courthouse, I needed to get back to my own office. My firm had been running on autopilot while I orchestrated the downfall of Reginald's empire, and there were major corporate deals waiting for my approval. I hugged Vivienne goodbye in the lobby, promising to meet her and my father for a celebration dinner that evening. My private driver took me straight to the sleek modern building that housed my mergers and acquisitions firm. When I stepped off the elevator onto my floor, the atmosphere was buzzing with an unusual frantic energy. My lead analyst, Marcus, was pacing in front of my glass office doors, clutching a thick red folder. He looked up as I approached, his eyes wide with urgency. "Boss, we have a massive situation," he said, falling into step beside me as I pushed open my office doors. "I am sorry to interrupt your personal leave, but this could not wait." "What is it, Marcus?" I asked, tossing my briefcase onto my desk and taking a seat in my leather chair. "I am officially back on the clock. And by the way, the name on the door needs to be changed to Clara Harrison by the end of the day." He blinked in surprise but quickly nodded, processing the information with the sharp efficiency I paid him for. "Understood, Clara," he said, opening the red folder and sliding it across my desk. "But we might not have a door to put your name on if we do not handle this immediately." I looked down at the documents. The logo stamped across the top of the crisp white paper belonged to Sterling Holdings. They were one of the largest, most ruthless corporate conglomerates on the East Coast. They were known for hostile takeovers, buying out smaller, successful firms and gutting them for their client lists. "Sterling Holdings just submitted an aggressive buyout offer for our entire firm," Marcus explained, his voice tight with anxiety. "And it is not a friendly proposal. Their CEO sent a notice claiming they have acquired 40% of our outstanding mezzanine debt through a third-party broker. They are threatening to call in the debt immediately unless we agree to a total acquisition at 20 cents on the dollar. They think, because you were tied up with the Washington family scandal, that our firm is vulnerable and distracted. They are trying to swallow us whole." I stared at the aggressive demand letter, feeling a familiar cold fire ignite in my veins. The CEO of Sterling Holdings clearly thought he was dealing with Layla Washington, the quiet, isolated woman fighting a desperate battle against her powerful adoptive family. He thought I was drowning in legal fees and emotional turmoil. He thought I was an easy target. He had absolutely no idea that he had just picked a fight with Clara Harrison, a woman who now had $85 million in liquid trust funds sitting in her bank account and the full weight of a generational dynasty standing behind her. I closed the red folder and slid it back across the desk. "Call the CEO of Sterling Holdings," I told Marcus, leaning back in my chair with a dangerous smile. "Set up a meeting for tomorrow morning in their main boardroom. Tell them the owner of this firm is coming to deliver her answer in person." The sleek glass elevators of the Sterling Holdings building rocketed upward, making my ears pop slightly as we ascended to the top floor. Marcus stood beside me, clutching his leather briefcase, his posture rigid with nervous anticipation. He had spent the entire night awake with my legal team executing the most aggressive financial maneuver of his career. I felt nothing but a sharp, crystalline focus. The door slid open to reveal a sprawling reception area decorated in cold gray slate and brushed steel meant to intimidate anyone who walked off the elevator. a receptionist led us down a long corridor and pushed open the heavy double doors of the main boardroom. Sitting at the head of a massive frosted glass table was Victor Sterling. He was a man who looked exactly like the corporate predator he was, with slicked-back silver hair, an expensive imported suit, and a smile that resembled a shark spotting a bleeding fish in the water. He did not even bother to stand up when I walked into the room. He just leaned back in his leather chair and gestured vaguely toward the empty seats opposite him. 3 of his senior lawyers sat along the side wall, their laptops already open and waiting to finalize my destruction. "Have a seat, Mrs. Washington," Victor said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy and heavy condescension. "I must say I am surprised you decided to come down here in person, given the absolute media circus currently surrounding your adoptive family. It must be incredibly difficult to run a boutique firm while your father and brother are facing federal indictments. I imagine you are feeling quite overwhelmed right now." I pulled out a chair and sat down, smoothing the skirt of my navy blue suit. Marcus sat next to me, placing my single blue folder on the glass table. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and clasping his hands together like a disappointed parent. "Look, I am not going to sugarcoat this," he continued, adopting a tone of false practicality. "Your firm is bleeding. Your personal reputation is tangled up in the Washington scandal, and your clients are going to start jumping ship the second the news cycle peaks. I hold 40% of your mezzanine debt. I can call that debt in by the end of the business day and force you into immediate bankruptcy. Or you can sign the acquisition papers my team has prepared. You walk away with a modest payout, and Sterling Holdings absorbs your assets. It is a life raft, Mrs. Washington. I suggest you take it before you drown with the rest of your family." I looked at the thick stack of acquisition contracts resting in the center of the table. I did not even lean forward to read the cover page. I simply looked back at Victor Sterling, letting the silence stretch until his arrogant smile began to falter just a fraction. "First of all," I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the large room, "my name is not Layla Washington. The fraudulent adoption was legally nullified by a federal magistrate yesterday morning. My legal name is Clara Harrison, and I am the sole heir and acting director of the Harrison Family Trust." The 3 lawyers along the wall suddenly stopped typing. The rhythmic clicking of their keyboards vanished, leaving a heavy, dead silence in the room. Victor blinked, his shark-like smile freezing entirely. "The Harrison Trust," he repeated, his voice losing its smooth edge as his brain scrambled to process the name. "What does that have to do with this firm?" "It means I have significantly more capital at my disposal than you do, Victor," I explained, keeping my eyes locked dead onto his. "When you sent that aggressive buyout offer yesterday afternoon, I did not panic. I simply made a few phone calls to the offshore holding companies that carry the primary debt for Sterling Holdings. It turns out that while you were busy trying to buy my debt, your own corporate liabilities were dangerously exposed. Your aggressive expansion strategy over the last 2 years left you highly leveraged. So last night, the Harrison Trust purchased the controlling majority of your commercial debt across all sectors." Victor stared at me, his face draining of color as the reality of my words began to crash over him. "That is impossible," he stammered, pushing himself up slightly from his chair, his hands pressing hard against the glass table. "You could not possibly move that kind of liquid capital in 12 hours. Nobody has that kind of instant liquidity." I reached forward and tapped the blue folder Marcus had placed on the table. I slid it smoothly across the frosted glass until it hit Victor's hands. "Read the transfer receipts," I suggested calmly. $85 million in liquid capital moves very quickly when you bypass traditional banking hours. I am not here to sell my firm to you, Victor. I am here to inform you that I am executing a hostile takeover of Sterling Holdings. By 3 p.m. today, your board of directors will receive formal notice of the acquisition. You are going to be completely liquidated, and your entire executive suite is going to be cleared out." Victor opened the folder with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the certified bank transfers and debt acquisition notices. He fell back into his chair, his chest heaving as he realized his entire empire had just been swallowed whole by the woman he thought he could bully into submission. "You cannot do this," he gasped, looking at me with pure venom. "This is vindictive, this is personal." Of course, it is personal," I replied, leaning forward and dropping my voice to a lethal whisper. "You thought I was just an easy target because of Reginald Washington. But you forgot to cover your own tracks." When Vivian's forensic team was digging through Reginald's old files to unravel his offshore accounts, we found the original capital investments for his corrupt real estate business. The illegal housing developments, the bribed city inspectors, the offshore accounts hiding the stolen funds. Reginald did not build that criminal empire alone. He had a silent partner providing the seed money from the very beginning. Victor's eyes widened in absolute terror, the legal papers slipping from his trembling fingers and scattering across the glass table. His breathing turned shallow and rapid as the invisible noose tightened around his neck. "It was you, Victor," I said, standing up from my chair and looking down at the ruined man. "You funded Reginald's entire criminal enterprise 20 years ago, and you used my fake adoption as a tax shelter to hide the dirty money. You thought the secret was safe because Reginald was taking the fall, but I have the original wire transfers with your signature on them. I am not just taking your company today, I am sending those documents straight to the federal prosecutor." 6 months passed since the morning I walked out of the Sterling Holdings boardroom, leaving Victor completely destroyed. The domino effect of handing over his private financial ledgers to the federal prosecutor was swift and utterly merciless. The paper trail connected every single one of Reginald's corrupt real estate deals straight to Victor's offshore accounts, exposing a 20-year conspiracy of massive fraud, embezzlement, and aggressive money laundering. The media had an absolute field day, with the scandal calling it the biggest corporate takedown in Georgia history. The Washington family name, once a powerful symbol of untouchable wealth and Southern prestige, was now completely synonymous with absolute disgrace. I walked up the wide concrete steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta, the crisp autumn wind catching the edge of my tailored wool coat. The plaza was absolutely swarming with aggressive reporters and news vans, their cameras flashing frantically as I approached. I did not flinch or look away. I simply kept my head held high, walking with the absolute certainty of a woman who had finally reclaimed her true identity. Vivian walked right beside me, radiating a calm, authoritative power that made the crowds naturally part to let us through. I was no longer the silent, obedient orphan they had abused and hidden away. I was Clara Harrison, and today I was here to watch my abusers face the final legal consequences of their unbridled arrogance. We entered the grand courtroom and took our seats in the front row, right behind the prosecutor's table. The room was packed to absolute capacity, the heavy wooden benches filled with curious spectators, angry, defrauded investors, and silent journalists furiously typing on their phones. The heavy wooden door beside the jury box swung open and the room fell dead silent. 2 armed federal marshals led the defendants into the room. Reginald Washington walked in first, and the sight of him actually made me pause. The imposing, terrifying patriarch, who used to control my every breath and dictate my entire existence, was completely gone. He was wearing a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles bound by heavy metal chains that clanked loudly against the polished floor. His posture was stooped, his face hollow and gray, his hair unkempt and thinning. Right behind him came Trey, his constant, arrogant smirk entirely erased. Trey was visibly shaking, his eyes darting frantically around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape that did not exist. Finally, Heather St. Clair shuffled into the room, her former country club elegance completely replaced by a pale, sickly pallor. She kept her head down, unable to even look at the gallery where her own ruined parents were conspicuously absent. Arthur and Penelope were currently dealing with their own federal indictments and had abandoned their precious daughter to save themselves. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise as the presiding judge entered the courtroom. Judge Marcus Thorne was a formidable man, known throughout the legal community for his absolutely zero-tolerance policy on corporate corruption. As he took his seat at the high mahogany bench, his dark eyes swept across the crowded room before landing directly on the front row. He looked at Vivian, and a very subtle but undeniable nod of deep respect passed between them. Vivian leaned over and whispered softly in my ear that Judge Thorne had been her brightest protege at Harvard Law 20 years ago. She had personally mentored him through his early career and guided his appointment to the federal bench. Reginald had spent his entire life buying off local judges and politicians, but he was completely powerless here. He was standing in a courtroom controlled by a man who viewed my true mother with absolute reverence. Judge Thorne opened the massive case file on his desk, the sound of the thick paper turning echoing in the quiet room. He looked down at the 3 broken figures standing before him. The evidence presented in this case is the most egregious example of systemic corporate fraud I have witnessed in my entire career on the bench. He began, his voice booming with cold, heavy authority. You built an empire on lies, stolen funds, and the deliberate exploitation of a vulnerable child who was entrusted to your care. The prosecution has provided irrefutable proof, including offshore bank ledgers, unauthorized trust fund transfers, and a recorded jailhouse confession that fully implicates every single one of you in this criminal enterprise. Trey let out a loud, pathetic sob, burying his face in his chained hands as the judge mentioned the recorded phone call. He finally realized that his own cowardly desperation was the exact nail in their collective coffin. Reginald just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenching in a final futile display of defiance, refusing to acknowledge that a girl he deemed worthless had orchestrated his ultimate downfall. Heather began to openly weep, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her ruined life finally crushed the last of her aristocratic pride. Reginald Washington, for your role as the primary architect of this racketeering enterprise, and your deliberate misappropriation of the Harrison Trust funds, you are sentenced to 45 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Thorne declared, bringing his wooden gavel down with a deafening crack. Reginald's knees buckled slightly, but the marshals grabbed his arms to pull him back to his feet. Trey Washington for multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to launder money. You are sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal facility. Trey let out a strangled scream of pure terror, begging the judge for mercy. But his desperate cries were completely ignored by the cold, unyielding room. Finally, Judge Thorne turned his sharp, unwavering gaze to Heather, who was barely able to stand on her own. Heather St. Clair, for your active participation in corporate fraud and managing illicit offshore accounts, you are sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The gavel slammed down again, sealing their fates completely and permanently. The marshals immediately began dragging the screaming, crying defendants toward the side door. Trey looked back at me over his shoulder, tears streaming down his red face, begging me to help him to remember that we were family. But I just sat there with a calm, peaceful expression on my face. They had stolen my childhood, but they would never steal another second of my future. I turned to Vivienne, who was smiling with quiet satisfaction, and we walked out of the courtroom together, ready to leave the past completely behind us. 6 months passed since that day in the federal courthouse. The crisp autumn air had finally surrendered to a humid Georgia spring, and my life had transformed into something entirely unrecognizable to the scared girl who used to sleep in a damp room above a detached garage. I was completely comfortable in my own skin, now wearing the name Clara Harrison, not as a heavy, cumbersome armor, but as my natural, absolute right. My firm was thriving beyond measure, acquiring international assets and dominating the Atlanta financial sector with brutal efficiency. I had absolutely everything I could ever want, and the shadows of my past were rapidly fading into distant memories. It was a warm Tuesday afternoon when I found myself in a part of the city I had not visited in a very long time. My private driver had taken an alternate detour to avoid heavy highway traffic roading us through a rundown suburban neighborhood of concrete strip malls and fading, cracked asphalt. I looked out the tinted window and asked him to pull over near a massive generic discount supermarket. It was the kind of cheap bulk grocery store where the fluorescent lights hummed constantly with an irritating buzz, and the floors were scuffed by thousands of tired, worn-out shoes. I did not really need anything specific, but I felt a sudden strange urge to walk through the crowded aisles to ground myself in the reality of ordinary life after spending so many consecutive months surrounded by exclusive penthouse suites and private marble boardrooms. I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors, stepping onto the cheap peeling linoleum floor. My tailored ivory silk suit and designer heels felt completely alien in this bleak environment. The store smelled faintly of industrial floor cleaner and overripe bruised produce. I grabbed a single bottle of imported sparkling water from a refrigerated end cap and made my way slowly toward the front checkout lanes. The lines were incredibly long, filled with exhausted mothers gripping handfuls of coupons and tired construction workers buying cheap frozen dinners to take home. I stepped into lane 4 and waited patiently behind a man buying bulk paper towels and cheap detergent. As the line slowly shuffled forward, I finally looked up at the cashier working the register. The breath caught in my throat for just a fraction of a second. It was Yvonne, the former undisputed queen of the Buckhead elite, the woman who used to host lavish, exclusive charity galas in custom silk gowns, was standing right there behind a cheap, dirty plastic scanner. She was wearing an incredibly unflattering bright green polyester vest over a faded white polo shirt that was slightly stained at the collar. A cheap plastic name tag was pinned crookedly to her chest reading, "Yvonne Cashier in Training." She was standing on a thin rubber fatigue mat, shifting her weight painfully from side to side. Her hands, which used to be weighed down by massive diamonds and flawless, expensive French manicures, were entirely bare. The skin was dry and rough from handling dusty cardboard boxes and dirty cash all day long. Her blonde hair had lost all of its expensive salon shine, pulled back roughly into a messy, frayed ponytail that exposed her dark roots. She looked 10 years older, her face deeply lined with pure exhaustion and profound, lingering bitterness. The federal government had frozen and seized absolutely everything she owned to pay back the victims of the racketeering scheme. With Reginald and Trey locked away in federal prison and all of her hidden offshore accounts drained by massive legal restitution payments, Yvonne had been dumped onto the street with nothing but the clothes on her back. None of her wealthy, fake country club friends had lifted a single finger to help her. She was completely alone, forced to work a grueling minimum-wage retail job just to afford a tiny, cramped apartment and basic groceries. The man in front of me pushed his heavy metal cart away, and I stepped up to the counter, placing my single clear bottle of water on the moving black rubber belt. Yvonne did not look up at first. She just mechanically grabbed the bottle, dragging it across the red laser until it emitted a loud, sharp beep. "Your total is $2.15, she mumbled, her voice raspy and dull, entirely stripped of its former aristocratic haughtiness. I reached into my purse and handed her a crisp, pristine $100 bill. The unusual large denomination made her pause. Her rough, tired fingers took the green paper, and her eyes slowly traveled up my ivory suit, past my perfectly manicured hands, up to my face. When Yvonne's eyes finally met mine, her entire body completely froze. The cheap plastic barcode scanner dropped from her hand, clattering loudly against the metal counter and rolling onto the floor. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost, leaving her skin gray and hollow. She opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. She just stared at me, her chest heaving as her eyes grew wide with a mixture of complete humiliation and absolute terror. She expected me to gloat right then and there. She expected me to throw her past cruelty in her face, to mock her current pathetic existence, and laugh at her hideous uniform. She braced herself for the insult, waiting for the bitter revenge of the girl she had tormented for 2 decades. But I felt absolutely no desire to speak to her. My ultimate victory did not require cruel words or petty public insults. My victory was the simple, undeniable reality of this exact moment. I looked at her with a calm, steady expression. I did not smile, but I did not frown either. I simply looked at her as if she were a complete stranger, as if she meant absolutely nothing to me at all, because she finally did. The silence stretched between us thick and incredibly suffocating for her. Her hands shook violently as she forced herself to open the cash register drawer and count out my change, $97.85. She held the crumpled bills out to me, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the money, her eyes welling with hot, humiliated tears. "Keep the change." "Yvonne," I said softly, my voice perfectly polite and entirely indifferent. "Consider it a donation." I took my bottle of water and walked away, leaving her weeping silently behind the register, trapped forever in the fluorescent misery of her new life. I walked out the automatic glass doors and stepped into the bright, warm afternoon sun, feeling lighter than air. At the exact edge of the curb, my chauffeur-driven black Maybach glided to a smooth, silent halt. The driver instantly stepped out in his crisp, dark suit and opened the heavy rear door for me, respectfully bowing his head. I slid into the luxurious, rich leather interior of the vehicle, closing the door with a solid, heavy thud that completely shut out the noise of the discount parking lot. The smooth ride in the back of the Maybach gave me time to let the profound silence of the afternoon settle into my bones. Staring out the tinted windows at the passing city skyline, I realized that a massive chapter of my life had finally and permanently closed. Yvonne was exactly where she belonged, facing the cold, harsh reality of the world without the stolen wealth she had used to terrorize others. My mind shifted to the evening ahead, and a completely different kind of energy began to course through my veins. Tonight was not about the past or the ruins of the Washington family. Tonight was about the future. Tonight was the ultimate triumph of black girl magic, of resilience, and of unapologetic power. The luxury vehicle glided seamlessly up the long, winding driveway of the Oakwood Country Club. This was the exact same pristine, manicured estate where Patricia and Reginald had dragged me for years. It was the place where I had been paraded around as their exotic charity case, forced to smile silently, while wealthy bigots patted themselves on the back for associating with such generous saviors. I used to hate this building with its towering white columns and stuffy elitist atmosphere. But tonight, the entire estate belonged completely to me. I had rented out the entire grounds under the Harrison Trust. When the car came to a gentle stop, the door was immediately opened by a uniformed attendant. Stepping out onto the red carpet, I was instantly greeted by a blinding sea of flashing camera bulbs. The local and national press were practically climbing over the velvet ropes, desperate to capture a photo of the woman who had single-handedly dismantled a corrupt empire. I did not look away or shy from the flashing lights. I stood tall, letting the cool evening breeze catch the flowing train of my dress. I was wearing a custom floor-length emerald green silk gown that fit my body, like a second skin radiating pure regal authority. My natural hair was styled in a towering, elegant crown, showcasing exactly who I was without a single drop of assimilation or compromise. The country club had been entirely transformed to erase the old oppressive energy. The stuffy portraits of former club presidents had been taken down and replaced by massive, beautiful banners bearing the name of my new organization, the Harrison Foundation for Adoption Justice. Stepping through the grand mahogany doors, I was immediately enveloped by the warm, rich sounds of a live jazz band playing in the corner. The ballroom was breathtaking, adorned with cascading arrangements of white orchids and dripping with sparkling crystal lighting. The room was packed to absolute capacity with the most influential politicians, activists, legal scholars, and philanthropists in the state. As I walked down the grand staircase, a sudden hush fell over the massive crowd. The music softly faded out, and then a thunderous wave of genuine applause erupted from the floor. They were clapping for the survivor who refused to be a victim. I walked across the room with a calm, steady grace, feeling the absolute pinnacle of black girl magic radiating from my every step. Marcus was the first person to greet me, looking incredibly sharp in a tailored black tuxedo. He handed me a crystal flute of sparkling water and gave me a smile, filled with immense, unshakable pride. "You look absolutely breathtaking, Clara," he said, his voice full of deep respect. "We did it. We actually pulled it off." I smiled back, tapping my glass against his. Right behind him was Vivienne, looking like pure royalty in a stunning silver evening gown. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a warm, fiercely protective embrace. It was the exact kind of genuine mother's love I had craved my entire life and finally found in the woman who helped me save myself. "I am so incredibly proud of you," Vivienne whispered, stepping back to look at me with tears shining in her eyes. "You took their darkness and turned it into pure light." The mayor of Atlanta stepped up to the main podium, tapping the microphone to call the room to attention. He gave a brief, powerful introduction, speaking about the necessity of protecting the most vulnerable members of society before calling me to the stage. I handed my glass to Marcus and walked up the steps, the emerald silk of my dress flowing elegantly behind me. I stood at the podium, looking out over the silent, captivated sea of faces. 1 year ago, I stood in this very building as a ghost. I began my voice echoing clearly through the massive ballroom. I was a prop used by corrupt individuals to hide their crimes and launder their money under the guise of saving a poor foster child. They stripped away my name, my identity, and my voice. They thought because I was young, black, and alone in the system that I was completely disposable. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that a seed buried in the dark does not die. It grows. The room was entirely silent, hanging on to every single word. "Tonight, we are officially launching a $50 million legal and financial trust dedicated entirely to uncovering and prosecuting adoption and foster care fraud," I announced. "The Harrison Foundation will provide elite, aggressive legal representation to children trapped in the system who are being exploited by the very people meant to protect them. We will audit the corrupt agencies, we will track the stolen funds, and we will ensure that no child ever has to silently endure what I survived. We are bringing justice to the invisible." I paused, looking directly at Vivienne and Marcus, who were beaming from the front row. My voice rose, filling the room with absolute, unbreakable power. "I am Clara Harrison. I am a survivor. I am the architect of my own destiny, and this is just the beginning." The entire ballroom absolutely exploded in a massive standing ovation. People were on their feet, wiping tears from their eyes, cheering with a fierce, roaring energy that shook the very foundation of the old country club. The applause washed over me like a warm, healing wave, washing away the last remnants of the pain I had carried for so long. I stepped down from the podium and walked right back into the waiting arms of my true family. The rest of the evening was a beautiful blur of joyous celebration, heartfelt laughter, and deep, authentic connection. Hours later, as the gala began to wind down, I walked out onto the grand stone balcony alone. I leaned against the cool railing and looked up at the clear, dark night sky. The soft melodies of the jazz band drifted out from the warm, glowing ballroom behind me, mingling with the gentle rustle of the ancient oak trees. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp night air, feeling a profound, absolute peace settling deep into my soul. They had tried to bury me, to erase me, to make me feel completely worthless. But they had failed spectacularly. The empire they stole had been reclaimed and repurposed to save thousands of other children. I looked at the bright stars shining fiercely against the dark velvet sky, completely surrounded by the love of my real family and the beautiful reality of my new life. I had finally found my way home. The greatest lesson from Clara Harrison's journey is that true power does not come from vengeance, but from reclaiming your own identity and refusing to be defined by the people who abused you. Her adoptive family tried to strip away her worth and use her as a shield for their corruption. But she used their own arrogance to build an unbreakable foundation. Healing begins the exact moment you stop seeking validation from toxic people and start fighting for the future you actually deserve. Share your story of breaking free from toxic family expectations in the comments below and subscribe today.